So this is basically a version of a presentation I gave last week at Sunstone Symposium called The Prosocial Gospel, using science and religion to construct a world that works for everyone. The theme of the Sunstone conference this year was many mansions. So I kind of have this inclusive kind of theme. And so I took this title from a few of the things that I'll be sharing with you guys today. If you know about Sunstone, they're kind of used to be a journal. Now they have like a podcast and a conference. And their overall motto is more than one ways to Morm, or more than one ways to Mormon, or something like that. So it's kind of, there's a lot of people from diverse branches of Mormonism within and without of the outside of the religion that are kind of interested in different aspects of the religion that come together. So a prosocial gospel, we'll talk about that. And that's what this will be. Feel free, if you have questions or things, to put them in the chat, and maybe I'll answer them as we go, if it fits in, and maybe we'll leave them till after if that works better. All right, so first, a picture. This is a picture of, the one on the left is me 25-ish years ago, maybe 24 years ago in Del Rio, Texas. And the one on the right is me just last week at Sunstone. And I'm sharing this picture because I guess to set it up, there's this interesting full circle kind of feeling in my life right now, where back 24 years ago in Del Rio, Texas, I had this kind of missionary zeal to share, you know, what those of us who have been raised LDS or Mormon talk about as the restored gospel. I had this like zeal to share this with others, this excitement, this commitment to work really hard and study a lot and share. And here it is 24 years later, and I'm feeling that, some of those same feelings, related but different. Some of those same feelings, but now it's about this kind of, some of the ways that a paradigm of science, of evolution science and contextual behavioral science, have emerged to point us in directions of making the world a better place. And very much some of that same kind of zeal and things waking me up early in the morning to get up and going and doing things. So 25 years ago, around this same week, this is myself and my dad outside of the Provo Temple, the LDS Provo Temple, where I had just what we call gotten my endowments taken out. So it's kind of one of the pinnacle ordinances, as many of you know, in the LDS church. And this was about just a week before I went into the missionary training center to then go spend 2 years. So it's an interesting time of reflection of this 25 years ago. I want to share with you, before we kind of get into more of the meat, just a couple of important, what I'd call conversions that have taken place in my life. And the first one came when I was in the MTC, Missionary Training Center. Well, first, I'm going to go back and just say one thing about this. You can see I look pretty young here. I had it written down, I was 19 going on 16 in this picture. You know, I was the kind of missionary out there where people always thought I was younger than I was. And I probably felt younger than I was, like pretty green behind the ears, but excited to go and do this stuff. I wouldn't say I was necessarily converted to the religion in a way that some people are. I was very much more wanting to do good, trusting my family, my parents, my siblings, and just excited. And I had a really wonderful experience as well. But when I got into the missionary training center, you're in these like classrooms where you're studying maybe 10 hours a day, some days, small cramped classrooms that sometimes smell kind of like stale farts and things like that. It's a very interesting experience. But there was this one experience I had while studying the Book of Mormon in there, where I was reading about Jesus Christ's visit to the Americas. That is a story told in the Book of Mormon. And in the story I was reading, and I was really captivated. I don't think I had really read it closely, if I had read it. And I was reading this story, and reading about the people who were listening to him when he was about to leave and return to his Father. And basically, here's what he told to them. He says, it came to pass that when Jesus had spoken, he cast his eyes round about again on the multitude, and behold, they were in tears, and did look steadfastly upon him, as if they would ask him to tarry a little longer with them. When I read that, I remember just feeling like I had the tears coming to my eyes. I felt like I was one of those people that just felt like I'm like them. I want this person to stay with me, even if I don't understand. I want to understand. I want to know the truth. I want to figure this out. And I wasn't prepared for the next verse, which just hit me even deeper. The next verse, this is what Christ allegedly says to them as he perceives that they want him to stay. He says unto them, behold, my bowels are filled with compassion towards you. And my experience, that what I remember, is being kind of consumed and filled with this sense of love that was in some ways familiar, but in some ways more powerful than I had ever felt in my life. And it was this deep acceptance kind of love that I just felt like, whatever this is, even if this is just brain chemicals, this is the most important thing, to help this feeling and this kind of experience of connecting with a seemingly transcendent kind of love experience. And the vocabulary I used for that was the feeling of the atonement. I felt this experiential reconciliation, acceptance, alignment with not just a divine power, but with the world that I lived in and the people around me. So that was a conversion experience. I was converted, you might say, to the healing power of the love of Christ at that time. Now, I was kind of a skeptic in a lot of ways growing up, I think naturally. And so even though I was able to testify of Christ, I don't know if I ever was as concerned about historicity or this scientifically corresponding. It was more of an experiential, I've experienced this thing, and I want to help others feel this or experience this. So a few years later, after my mission, I was working at the state hospital, and this is another conversion moment, but different. It was a kind of a conversion to the reality of suffering in the world. We have this picture of Christ on the left-hand side, Christ showing people, showing us something maybe we don't want to see. But working at the state hospital, it was very kind of existentially and faith-wise kind of shaking in terms of to realize people are imprisoned by severe mental illness. And so I was, in a sense, converted to a sense that hell is real on earth, and really having a strong desire to figure out how to help people, if possible, to experience healing in this life. And it felt very much like a kind of a religious or spiritual necessity to do that. And then the last thing I'll share, the last important conversion came maybe, or not the last, but another one relevant to this topic today, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, 8 years ago, I think, actually. This is Sonny, our second son, and he was he had a lot of anger when he was younger, and it was difficult for my wife and I. We were pretty laid back people, and it was hard for us to know how to kind of work with him in his anger, and we used timeouts, or we called them time alones. And we would do this, and it would work just in the sense that he was in a different room, and so we wouldn't hear him yelling at us as much. But as the time went on, it didn't feel like, it just seemed like the overriding story in our relationship was he is an angry child, which didn't feel good. And I was at a training for dialectical behavioral therapy, an intensive training. I had never been a fan of behavioral therapy before this time, but I liked DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, because of the mindfulness approach and some of the other approaches. But I opened up to behavioral science and entered with kind of curiosity. And I learned the deeper version of behavioral science, rather than just like kind of sticker charts and kind of carrots and sticks in an arbitrary way. I learned that these forces of behavioral shaping are happening whether we realize it or not. And the way I learned it was in this statement, basically pay more reinforcing attention to the behavior you want to see more of, and less reinforcing attention to the behavior you want to see less of. So I went home from this training in Portland and I talked to my wife, Joanna. I said, let's try something different with Sonny. Instead of being present and interacting and engaging more intensely when he's yelling, let's try to like kind of act like water off a duck's back and just let it be, and not ignoring him out of spite, but not really pay as much attention to that. But then as soon as we see even a particle of the other kind of behavior, of him just not yelling when we thought he would, or even being kind, but even just seeming at peace and not yelling at his brother or someone else, let's try to reinforce that. And one of the reasons I wanted to do this, because I realized I had been doing the opposite. When I came home from work, if my kids were playing peacefully, I would walk right by them and think, oh, good, now I can do my own thing. And then as soon as I hear yelling and screaming and fighting, then I would be there and I'd be present. And so I learned at this training that that's something that's called, that's inadvertent reinforcement potentially. So anyway, we tried this other way. And literally in a few weeks' time, we saw more change in his aggressive behavior than we had seen in 7 years of timeouts. And all it was just really putting more loving attention kind of sporadically towards him when he was just being, just walking around the house doing whatever, just going up and paying more loving attention. And it was really interesting to see the change. And so I was converted to a compassionate and deliberate use of behavioral principles to shape behavior. And of course, I was already a therapist at this time. I was mostly using kind of client-centered humanistic approaches. But I realized that an ethical and compassionate use of behavioral science is the most humane thing I could think of, because people come to therapy often because they do want to change patterns of behavior that are very difficult to change. And this was important, especially with the clients that I was working with who had more severe struggles, and creating an empathic space didn't seem to be enough to really help. And so this therapy, DBT, and this understanding of behavioral science helped a lot. So here's a picture of me and Sonny in the Matrix, because that's kind of what it felt like when I got converted to these behavioral principles of science. It felt like I could see these kind of invisible factors shaping interactions in myself, in my family, in my clients. And I could see how they could be manipulated for harm, but they could also be manipulated for healing and for compassion, and that it's happening whether we know it or not. Like gravity, principles of gravity are affecting us whether we realize them or not. We're training each other, we're shaping each other. And so learning how we're doing that and learning to do that in a loving and a compassionate way is what I came around to. So that's basically a long intro to this. So the rest of the time we're going to be spending on this prosocial gospel. What is prosocial? It's deliberate evolution. It's the convergence of these three different branches of science. What would a prosocial gospel look like? And then if we get to it, this idea of God as life and love unfolding. In a sense, God as evolution, but specifically evolution of principles worth serving and sacrificing for, and worth expanding into the world, worth even proselytizing into the world. So what is prosocial? It's this convergence of three branches of science: evolution science, contextual behavioral science, and political economics. I'm going to first start and tell you a little bit more about contextual behavioral science. That's the area of my expertise. That's what my job is as a therapist, is using the theories and interventions from contextual behavioral science to alleviate suffering. And so here we have these three branches, and these images are just, they're important figures, but they're not the only important figures in these areas. But sometimes it helps to have faces on slides instead of words. So we have David Sloan Wilson, who developed and is developing multi-level selection theory. We have Stephen Hayes, who kind of is one of the main figureheads of contextual behavioral science and founded acceptance and commitment therapy and relational frame theory, and those are the kind of psychotherapy. And then Lynn Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for economics in 2009. And so we're going to talk a little bit about their work and how, this is the stuff I've been studying kind of intensely in the last year and a half or so. So contextual behavioral science, it starts from the same place in some ways that Buddhism starts, that life is painful, life is suffering, it's inevitable that there will be suffering, and that there is some freedom from suffering. Maybe not all pain, like pain will be inevitable, but sometimes our reactions to pain and suffering actually compound and make suffering worse. And so contextual behavioral science is a research and practice paradigm and field trying to help alleviate suffering. So very much, after my mission, it very much fit when I found, this framework fit the things I had been converted to on my mission, the goal of helping to alleviate suffering and promote well-being and compassion. The psychological flexibility is kind of the one of the interesting outcomes or constructs from this field. So just a brief overview of contextual behavioral science. I mentioned it's a research and practice paradigm concerned with reducing human suffering. It has a functional contextualist truth criterion. That means instead of the truth being some formal thing that corresponds with something else, in this field that seeks to alleviate suffering and to promote healing, the truth is something that works towards a valued goal, right? And so when we're like analyzing and assessing behavior, not all behavior is the same because of its form. We have to understand the function of the behavior. So a nap for one person might be a really healthy behavior in a certain context. It might function in a very healthy way. And a nap for another person might be really related to suicidal thoughts and desires to escape. And it might be really an unhealthy behavior for another person. So truth is functional and contextual. Contextual behavioral science approaches, oftentimes they have a lot of acceptance and mindfulness strategies, other contemplative approaches that are woven in, and they're studied scientifically, and they've been, you've seen and heard of these things kind of filtering in, not just in therapy, but in our culture. Dialectics is part of the main method I use, dialectical behavioral therapy, where you're synthesizing apparent opposites. And so using opposites not as enemies, but as two different things that actually hold partial truths, and synthesizing them, you continually come to more helpful and more true and more beautiful ways of being. And then processes of change. This is a big part of what contextual behavioral science is about, is understanding how things and people change, thoughts, behaviors, emotions, ideas, but also groups. And that's what we'll get more into the prosocial later. So this is just one of many ways of kind of like one tool within contextual behavioral science. It's called an ACT matrix from acceptance and commitment therapy. So this matrix of these 4 quadrants are kind of, you can, do this, with whether that's in a clinical setting or just on your own, where you're kind of using these different quadrants to on one hand, ask what matters most. And when people sit with that question, these are some of the things that might come up. These are kind of values or ideals, things that we wouldn't necessarily cross off a list, but they would be maybe like a guiding North Star, guiding compass for our lives. So clarifying our values is a part of psychological flexibility. But more than clarifying the values, we have to kind of wrestle those values to earth. We need to embody them. We need to figure out how to kind of bring the things that we value, the things that are up in the clouds, like the things that make life worth living, bring those down into our actions, into our lives. However, there's this other side of this matrix, which is things that kind of take us away oftentimes from what matters. And these are very normal. These are very human things that we experience. And I have these as examples. They'll be different for different people, but these are just the types of things that might come up, things that get in the way. And in this 4th quadrant, what are the things we're doing when we're more reacting from those things in the quadrant 3? We might be avoiding or escaping or busy work or disengaged or coping in whatever maladaptive ways. And then these arrows represent a kind of vicious cycle that tends to be, this is when people come to therapy, is they're in this vicious cycle or they've been in it. And so these vicious cycles are really difficult. And the more we avoid, it's actually, this stuff gets worse. And so it's really difficult. And some of the vicious cycles are so vicious that people have to get out of them or else they won't survive. But some of them are kind of subtle for most people. And so people can live their whole life in kind of a maladaptive avoidance cycle, and never really, have to confront it, but it will still be kind of a difficult way of going. What happens when we get in these vicious cycles between the stuff on the left-hand side is that, we don't have time to do the stuff in this second quadrant, some of our valued behaviors. And at the same time, the stuff in that first quadrant become a little bit hazy and unclear. We kind of forget about what matters to us. We get really zeroed in and focused on avoiding our pain. So the idea here with this ACT matrix is, this is one way of conceptualizing how to work with our pain differently. A lot of it is just, we're going to have pain. How do we work with our pain? So the idea is, instead of getting rid of any of it, we're going to try to notice our experience. This is the mindfulness and acceptance stuff. We're going to try to accept. Acceptance doesn't mean we like it necessarily, but it means we are kind of letting go of a willful forcing, reaction to it. We're letting it be. We're kind of long suffering, if you will. And then we have more clarity to choose and to remember what we care about and what works to embody what we care about. So we have this kind of process for, we're not trying to get rid of any of these parts of our experience. We're trying to notice and remember, and then commit to what we care about and engage in what is meaningful to us. And it's very much small things. It's not about, we have to do this huge thing. It's very small things that can help us connect with what matters. So this is an example of, one way of working with psychological flexibility, just kind of a tool that is used in contextual behavioral science. There's many different tools, many different methods and metaphors and things. This is just a tool, the ACT matrix, to help people. But really what happens is, it's not the insight that changes, it's actually the doing these things, engaging in things that we care about, tends to have a virtuous cycle where our pain is not gone. In fact, sometimes there's new pain from engaging in valued action, but it gets easier and easier to kind of remember what we care about and engage in it, even when it's uncomfortable. So here's a little, nerdy kind of therapy tree I made for myself of visualizing contextual behavioral science. Don't worry about, learning it or anything. If some of you know about therapy, there's this alphabet soup of different therapy modalities. Less important or more important than the different therapy modalities is finding what works to help people have a life worth living, to help people heal from sometimes unimaginable pain and suffering. That realization I had at the state hospital, that hell is real and hell is on earth in the minds and hearts of people who are stuck in intense suffering. It is still very, very true. And any person who does trauma therapy will tell you that when people are coming in to courageously confront traumas and go through targeted trauma treatment, it is like going into hell for them. And there is healing out of that. So we're going to talk now, that's just a little bit of contextual behavioral science. Now I want to talk about evolution science. That's not my expertise. That's where I've been learning a lot in the last year and a half. But just to say, evolution science undergirds or underlies contextual behavioral science. And we'll talk about how that is. This is David Sloan Wilson, and I've been, kind of engaging in his work a lot in the last 18 months or so. So before David Sloan Wilson, B.F. Skinner, the radical behaviorist, who was the kind of the father of behaviorism, he already was talking about behavioral shaping and operant conditioning as selection by consequences. And by selection, he means natural selection, as in, well, it could be natural or arbitrary, but basically behavior being selected and maintaining due to its consequences. And that's what, you can call it learning by consequences, you can call it selection by consequences. And consequences here doesn't mean like the consequences of a parent or a teacher, but it could be that'd be arbitrary, but natural consequences is typically what we're talking about. There's this concept called evolutionary mismatch that has been really helpful to me. The idea is the real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, and it is terrifically dangerous, and it is now approaching a point of crisis overall. This is E.O. Wilson, who is a sociobiologist. And this, even before I was studying evolution, this kind of idea was very clear to me when I was working at an addiction treatment center, and I kind of started seeing the world very much through the eyes of like, oh, we're all addicted, you know, and it's through evolution. Like short-term reinforcers are more powerful than long-term reinforcers. And I remember thinking, driving to home from work one day, thinking if my goal was to make a lot of money, I would find something legal that's addicting and open up a very small store with very little overhead with a drive-through. And I would, and I thought soft drinks, that would be perfect. If I wanted to make a lot of money, that's what I would do. I would have some sort of a drive-through where you just sell caffeinated sugar water to people. And pretty soon I started seeing Swig and Sodalicious and all that pop up. And I was like, yes, people are going to make a lot of money like this. And it's going to be really unhealthy. But that's an example of evolutionary mismatch. I started seeing it everywhere, though. I started seeing it in, I mean, everyone sees this. We just don't all have that language of evolutionary mismatch. It's in the way that we consume information and news and things. And we'll show you a little, do a little demonstration. So a short experiment. Which would you or your kids, if you have them, rather eat? It might be different for different people, but just, so we've got nerds. I actually don't even like nerds, but I used to when I was a kid, like just little sugar balls. Nerds or raw vegetables. Now, many of you would, Joe, I can see my brother Joe's like, I'd rather do the raw vegetables. It's true. But there is something about our brains and our bodies that are wired for sugar and fat. I used to have a big cheeseburger up here instead, which would be more appealing to some of us. So we know our long-term, what we would say in the long term, but you could use a different idea to come up with, like, there's something about things that are not necessarily healthy for us in the long term that our bodies and brains have developed to crave things that are not necessarily healthy for us in the long term. So which would you rather watch on TV, a documentary about Thich Nhat Hanh and cultivating mindfulness, or would you rather watch, a police chase live on the news? And my guess is a lot of you guys are saying, I'd rather eat vegetables and watch Thich Nhat Hanh. However, you enlightened few are not like the rest of society, or else that's what we'd be watching on the local news. We'd be watching people doing mindfulness, and we'd be watching, and we'd all of our kids would be begging for more vegetables every night, and less dessert. And so it's just, people can develop into healthy habits, certainly, but we have this evolutionary mismatch problem. Okay, so here's some other examples. In economics, sometimes they talk about perverse incentives, inadvertent reinforcement or punishment, like the example with me and Sonny, where I wanted him to be more calm and peaceful, but I was doing kind of the opposite thing, because we were actually training each other to being more and more confrontational as he got older. And as soon as I did this thing that seemed counterintuitive, and I paid more attention to him when he was peaceful and less attention to him when he was acting out, it changed. All these, like, some people use this term attention capture for like our social media and marketing environment. We have all these phrases like sex sells, and people talk about limbic hijacks. Local news, there's a saying in local news, if it bleeds, it leads. And then we have this negativity bias. Sometimes I like to think of it as the referee phenomenon, where we are, if you're watching a sporting event, you don't notice the referee at all unless he messes up. Then you notice him pretty quickly. If he's doing his job really well, you don't notice him. And that is a similar phenomenon with a negativity bias with sometimes our kids or our partner, our spouse, or people who are really close to us. We kind of get used to, like, things are supposed to be this way. So when they're doing things well, we don't even notice it. But as soon as they do something that annoys us, it's like, it's that referee phenomenon. And then oftentimes we inadvertently reinforce that. Okay, so moving on from, okay, so basically back to this tree of contextual behavioral science, like I knew that this stuff works, and I've seen it perform, I would even call it miracles, with individual people who are in intense suffering, people who have had years, even decades of suffering. And I've seen some of these methods applied dramatically change people's lives. Sometimes it takes several years, but I've seen it. But I was very unsure, like something's missing. You know, my background is social work, and they really do a good job of making us feel guilty about just focusing, if we're going to just go into private practice or just do individual therapy, and say, hey, hold on, what about the bigger picture? What about the systems? What about society as a whole? Like, how are we addressing societal problems? And so I've wondered ever since, you know, graduate school and before. My undergrad was sociology, but I've wondered, you know, who is scaling up these therapies and these principles that really work for individuals? Who's scaling them up to the level of society? Is that even possible? Is that stupid? Does that not work? You know, or is it possible? So that's where prosocial comes in, and we're going to go a little further into evolution science. Here's a bunch of different types of finches. Darwin, you know, studied his finches, and he noticed, you know, they all had these commonalities. He really intuited that they were from likely the same original finch, but the differences seemed to very much be fit to their environment. And so he had this amazing kind of insight of, like, you know, the idea that these three principles of variation or differences between individual units, you might say, or organisms, would be more likely selected or fit for the environment they're in. And the ones that are more adapted to the environment will be passed on to their offspring. It's this beautiful way of understanding things without even knowing about genes or anything, knowing the mechanisms. He could just observe the environment and the phenotype or the characteristics of the individual species. And so we have basic principles of evolution: variation, selection, heritability. And then this is the newer stuff that's like pretty exciting in the last 20 years. The new directions in evolution science, which one is multiple streams of inheritance, which means genetics or genes are not the only stream of inheritance of evolution, and multi-level selection, which is kind of a new take that's been more accepted of group selection. Group selection was mostly kind of panned and not accepted, but multi-level selection is a variation of that is gaining traction and acceptance. So Darwin didn't know anything about genes when he wrote The Origin of Species. He just knew that he was able to kind of functionally sell, well, there's mechanisms going on, but the important thing was kind of the variation, selection, retention. And then 4 streams of genetic inheritance. This is where, you know, genes operate based on those 3 principles of variation, selection, retention, but so do epigenetic processes, so do behavioral and cultural processes. So those are more an open-ended system. And that's where human evolution is quite unique compared to other species that we know of. And it has to do with language and technology. So multi-level selection. So one of the problems for Darwin's theory has been altruism, and he was stumped by this. You know, this idea of, you know, if evolution is all about passing your traits on down to your offspring, then no species, no individual unit would be incentivized to sacrifice their potential for passing on traits to their offspring. So this is a question that has arisen, and people tried to answer it with group selection and kin selection. And there's been some, you know, there's a lot of stuff on that. Multi-level selection goes further and demonstrates how kind of altruism and cooperation might be not a bug in human evolution, but might be the feature of human evolution. It might be why humans have evolved to be so successful in every climate and progressing in kind of knowledge and power to such a degree. So here's a way of thinking of multi-level selection. Think of a board game like Settlers of Catan. And when there's one board game going on, think of that as a group, right? One game. So you have a group of two playing this game. And when this group of two is playing, you have within group competition, or in evolution terms, within group selection. And so you might call that selfishness, in the sense that your strategies and your behaviors are about, how do I beat this other person? And games are very fun. So we don't experience it as selfish. It's a fun way to compete, right? So now, but imagine for a moment that you have 6 different games going on, and instead of like instead of like a bracket tournament, it's like the table who gets to where everyone gets their victory points the soonest, like their group wins, right? So imagine that the table who, with all of they get, or let's say all of them get to a combined 25 victory points or something like that. Imagine that table would win versus these 6 other ones. Then imagine that the strategies would change, right? The way you're playing the game. And this, in multi-level selection, this would be called between group selection. So instead of within group selection, which was this one, this is between group selection. And when between group selection is happening, all of a sudden, altruistic groups are going to perform better than selfish groups. And there's actually an experiment, I don't have a slide for it, but there's an experiment of hen laying eggs, where you have, this guy was experimenting with chickens and their productivity in terms of laying eggs. And he did it a couple different ways. He had chickens in cages of 9 chickens per cage. And he was able to measure the most productive egg-laying hens. And in one experiment, he took all the top performing chickens out and put them in the same cage to see if they were going to outperform everyone else. And it ended up that only 3 of the chickens survived. 6 of them were killed off, right? And then he did it a different way, where he took the highest performing group and compared it. And that highest performing group just got better and better and better, right? So the idea here is that altruism is encouraged through evolution when the group is an altruistic group. But when there's individuals competing within a group, selfish traits do tend to benefit the individual. All right, so getting back to multi-level selection here, let's see. So here we have, imagine groups of groups. Now imagine that all of these tables are collaborating. They have a common purpose or a common goal, right? So it might be chaotic, but their strategies are all going to be like, how do we all do this thing together that's really important? And this is kind of what Prosocial is aiming at doing. How do we identify that we're all on the same team, right? It's difficult because identity tends to be more powerful when we're identifying an enemy. But the enemy could be a clock. The enemy could be, climate change or a pandemic, or it could even be, the enemy could be, selfishness itself. But here's an example. This is an image of some of the volunteers going to help with the boys in Thailand who got trapped in the cave, the soccer team. That was an example of a bunch of different organizations and cultures and people coming together and collaborating with a common goal to rescue these boys who are trapped in this cave. So, but this is what tends to happen is what might be prosocial or collaboration in one setting might lead to war, or genocide even, when we're identifying against something, which tends to be what happens. We collaborate, however, there is always typically a collaborating against. And so that's one of the dilemmas with altruistic behavior. We can look at altruistic behavior in a tribe, a hunter-gatherer tribe, or there was some writing in one of the books I read about this anthropologist noting how equitable the Navajo, I think it was Navajo Indians were towards each other, and how peaceful and loving they were, but then how ruthless they were to their enemies that didn't seem that different from them. So something that's very prosocial inside the group can be potentially horrific, even genocidal outside of that group. So the idea of this idea here with prosocial, well, a couple of things. One, evolution isn't necessarily nice. So sometimes we get stuck in this naturalistic fallacy that whatever exists is good, is meant to be, rather than like certain conditions might arise to evolve something that's really antisocial in humans or elsewhere. Cooperative groups are not necessarily nice to outside groups. So it would be nice if this is like, if we had this unity kind of thing, and sometimes in the course of this, entity of USA, there's been more unity, oftentimes after very difficult trials. But then we have this image. I like this bottom image of especially, this is one of the election maps kind of showing this kind of bifurcated kind of thing. So a last thought here on multi-level selection. So an individual human, this is one of the biggest takeaways that for me is mind-blowing. An individual human is a site of collaborating groups of groups. There's trillions of microorganisms, thousands of different species inside of each of us, bacteria, cells, organs, and systems cooperating for individual well-being and homeostasis. So multi-level selection goes both ways. It scales up to the level of groups and groups of groups, but it goes down into cells. So the immune system is now being considered an evolutionary process of collaborating groups of groups. And at the same time, groups can function like a single organism. And so another way of thinking about that is that in an individual person, kind of using Mormon or just religious terms, an individual person is worlds without number, and a group of people can be a unified body that spreads valued peace and loving kind of properties. And the idea with prosocial is, with the technology we have and the things we're facing, it's essential that we basically figure out how to create a global ethic of identity, where we still have our own unique identities, but we have a transcending identity as part of life, as not even just identity of humans, but identity of kind of part of the earth, part of living systems, because we can't, as humans, evolve or exist in a vacuum. We need the living systems that we're part of. Okay, so that's some of the evolution science stuff. Going over into the political economics. This stuff is pretty exciting. So Lynn Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2009. She studied groups that collaborate to try to manage common pool resources. So years before, in I think the 60s, there was a famous article written called The Tragedy of the Commons. And the thesis was basically that if you have a common pool resource like a forest or a fishery or something that like is a resource that will be diminished and not naturally grow itself back, the idea was you have to either have a centralized government to come in and manage it, or you have to have it be privatized. So Lynn Ostrom wondered about that. She wasn't sure if that was true or not. She wanted to study it. So she studied hundreds and hundreds of groups and did really in-depth qualitative and quantitative analysis. And she came up with, and won the Nobel Prize for this work, she came up with 8 core design principles that more or less the groups that were successful followed. And then she met David Sloan Wilson, and David Sloan Wilson was so excited because he was saying, this is perfect. This is cultural evolution, and it's showing this is what successful groups do across many, 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 many differences. They tend to do these things. They tend to, especially, they have a shared purpose and identity. People know if they're part of the group and they know what the purpose is. They tend to have an equitable distribution of costs and benefits. So you don't have one person or a few people shouldering all the load, and then you don't have a bunch of kind of free riders who have the capability to help but don't, right? They tend to have more of an equitable distribution of that. This decision-making process, whether it's one person or the whole group, whatever the decision-making process, people in the group perceive it as fair. They perceive that it's a fair decision-making process. The fourth one was monitoring or transparency. Basically, like, there was kind of, in these commons, there was a sense of, you can't really get away with doing a lot of stuff in secrecy. Like, people are kind of aware of basically what's going on. let's say with the shared fishing boats, or with the forest or whatever, or with water rights. You know, she didn't just study indigenous populations, she studied modern coalitions of groups as well. The fifth core design principle is graduated sanctions with potential for expulsion, which sounds quite harsh, but it tends to make people feel safe if there's a sense of there is a limit here. You know, there's certain behaviors that this group will not be okay with. And if someone goes beyond that, then they're not going to be able to be in this group. Fast and effective conflict resolution, very important. And then appropriate level of autonomy for the group to achieve its goals, as well as effective relations with other groups. So Lynn Ostrom, before she passed away, and David Sloan Wilson took her core design principles and kind of adapted them from descriptive principles into prescriptive. If evolution is happening, if we are more a part of it, whether we want to be or not, like we're actually designing it more than we realize, then we need to have some sense of how to do this and study it and figure it out. So these became prescriptive, not just descriptive. So then so this is basically what prosocial, so what's the big deal with all this? What I'm saying is the big deal for me. Well, I go back to this picture basically. Like when I was this, 19, 20-year-old in Del Rio, Texas, I was certain that what I was doing was just the most I could do to make the world a better place. And I had a wonderful experience. In retrospect, I think it probably was more beneficial for me than it was for a lot of the people that I was around. And I've talked to a lot of people since then who had really awful experiences on their mission. So I know it's not the same for everyone. It's very contextual. But I've also become more of a functional believer in the sense that I don't know what exists out there. I don't know about a heaven or a hell after this life. I know that there's intense suffering now. I know that there's real challenges now. And I know that there's transformative love and presence and things that are available now that are worthy of learning and helping others learn. And so that's the big deal to me is I've known that at the individual level, but prosocial has given me a sense that not just do we have this kind of therapeutic or humanistic hack for the atonement, which I know might be very offensive to some people, but we also have a kind of direction for if we're trying to build what LDS people or restorationist people might call Zion, if we're trying to build a world that works for everyone, we have some more practical ways of thinking about that. So I'm going to skip this part. So here's just a list of a bunch of organizations I know of that they're not necessarily religious organizations. In fact, only one of them on here is a religious organization, but these are pro-social organizations. Some of them are explicitly pro-social, like Prosocial World. That is David Sloan Wilson's kind of organization, him and a few others, Paul Atkins and others. The ACL Global Project, this is another that comes out of contextual behavioral science that I'm planning on starting up a chapter of this next year, 2023. But basically, it's very exciting to me that people are taking these methods and trying to scale them up to like, how do we take this out of the clinical office and put this in our communities? And this is just some. I actually have a long spreadsheet of that I'm maybe going to turn into a website with kind of a pro-social hub where you can see different things. Circles is one that my dad and mom had participated in, and that Joanna and I did for a while. We have some other friends trying to end intergenerational poverty. And then Community of Christ, interesting. I've been doing an interfaith fellowship. If you don't know Community of Christ, they sometimes describe themselves as Emma's church. So you have the mainstream LDS church is Brigham's church, and then the Community of Christ used to be called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the RLDS. Now they're called Community of Christ. And I've been doing an interfaith fellowship with them, and it's really fascinating from an evolutionary perspective to see these two branches. And I see them as in many ways aspirational for where the mainstream LDS church could go, might not go, but not just in terms of prioritize certain beliefs or doctrines and deprioritizing others, but even more in the governance structure, in the decision-making process. I didn't start doing an interfaith fellowship with them because I thought they were pro-social, but when I started looking into them more, I was already studying all this stuff, and I found that they, looking at the core design principles, they lined up really powerfully with them in an interesting way. So now let's go to what would a pro-social gospel look like. I'm going to try, I know some of you guys might need to leave, and so if you do, that's totally fine. So here's a quote from Adam Miller, like just to address why do we even need to worry about evolution? If you're a religious person, why not just let God do what he does and not worry about it? He says, generations of theologians are jealous of our day. On no merit of our own, we've inherited the task of probing the theological implications of the planet-sized shift in our self-understanding imposed by the latter-day revelations of biological evolution and deep geological time. We have a lot of work to do. And then going back further, this is an interesting statement. Brigham Young and some of his contemporary church leaders and theologians, I think they were quite influenced by the natural philosophers of the day. He says, yet I will say with regard to miracles, there is no such thing save to the ignorant. That is, there never was a result wrought out by God or by any of his creatures without there being a cause for it. There may be results, the causes of which we do not see or understand, and what we call miracles are no more than this. They are the results of effects of causes hidden from our understandings. So what happens when we start to understand, even with still some humility intact, what happens when we start to understand some of these causes and we start to see that some of the ways we're structuring society are creating unnecessary suffering and compounding unnecessary suffering at the individual, but even more at the group level, right? This is, he had another quote I didn't put up here about if we find ourselves in hell, we're going to have to, kick out the devils and figure out how to get out of hell. There's a practicality there I really like. So what would a pro-social gospel look like? It'd be more of an accurate and functional understanding of life and human reality. So more of a kind of a friend to science and paying attention to science as if it is God's revelation, still with the kind of helpful humility and the awareness that science is best when it's kind of challenging its own ground in a sense. Using methods to alleviate suffering and promote well-being at the individual level, even if they come from secular places, right? A pro-social gospel would look like promoting values and effective collaboration at the level of the group and groups of groups. So it's not just about individual healing. It's not just, we hear a lot of things about, it's always about first you change the inside, then you change the outside. What multi-level selection points us to is that, and just a lot of other stuff, is that the environment shapes people quite a bit, and it's a lot easier to facilitate healing and growth and pro-sociality if the environments that we're in are safe, are healing, promote those kinds of things. Okay, and a pro-social gospel wouldn't necessarily be religious. I'm thinking of it broadly, the good news. Although I would say that there's something about religion, David Sloan Wilson, although an atheist, he wrote a book called Darwin's Cathedral. And one of his main premises is to kind of test out empirically, are religions better thought of like how Richard Dawkins thinks about them as kind of an evolutionary parasite, or are they better to be thought of as potentially a pro-social carrier, if you will, like a vehicle for cultural evolution, which could be really damaging, but it also could be really helpful and really healing. And that's what he found, was that the majority of religions that he studied seemed to be adaptive in that way, and certainly could go wrong, right? All right, so more about what would a pro-social gospel look like. So I know I kept you guys here for an hour already, so let's see here. What we'll do is, this is going back to that kind of idea of functional contextualism. Even before I got into the pro-social stuff and knowing more about evolution, this was already happening for me. Certain terms were starting to become expanded for me, and certain terms started meaning something different to me as I was finding, kind of my belief in not my belief, but my trust in science and evidence-based therapies and my experience of working with people at that level, you know, I think always kind of trumped my my trust in alleged supernatural things. So I'm very drawn to kind of materialist versions of theology. But I'm not going to go through all of these. These are just some different language that started to make sense for me over time. So briefly, because I did this at Sunstone, and Sunstone is kind of looking at Mormonism specifically, I've done some just rudimentary analysis of my own, from my own perspective, of the LDS Church and these core design principles. And so on shared purpose and identity, there's a lot of strengths there. You know, people are singing songs about their identity from a young, you know, and if you have really negative feelings about the church, that would be brainwashing. But if you have positive feelings, it would be like really healthy socialization, right? So there's all sorts of strengths there, but then there's weaknesses, especially now. There's a really strong tension, I perceive, and I think others, in terms of, is the purpose of the LDS Church to kind of spread God's unconditional love, or God's love for people, for all people, or is it kind of to maintain this what you might call a heteronormative, like a gospel of like a 1950s identity of family, of a nuclear family? The potential I see is a rallying point of healing compassion and building peaceful community. So here, the strength I see in the LDS Church is rotating lay clergy in terms of equitable distribution of costs and benefits. Weaknesses, there's a lot of people left out. There is the church welfare, which does help a lot of people, but certainly there's a lot of people left out, and the sense of inequality, I think, is only growing for people, for many people. And of course, you see many people leaving, you know, not basically, it affects the first core design principle. So we'll just go through these kind of quickly here. A strength could be ongoing revelation, could be counsels. A strength could be the sense that God's making decisions. When I say a strength, I'm not saying value positive. I'm saying a strength for the group to continue to grow. The more that people feel like God is making the decisions, the more people are going to be feeling like those decisions are fair. But a weakness, more and more, is as people sensing that they don't have any role in decision-making power for the group, maybe even at times for their own lives or their own families. Sociocracy, I mentioned down here, that's a very fascinating method of decision-making, consent-based decision-making, that is, it's just fascinating. Check it out if you haven't. Sociocracy. Monitoring and transparency, you know, there's a lot. I'm not going to go through all these, but basically, you can look at these core design principles, and you could take any organization. You could take a church. You could take your own family. You could take the business you work for, a nonprofit. You could take a government at the local or at the national level. But you could kind of assess and then try to like adapt using these core design principles that Lynn Ostrom and David Sloan Wilson adapted. So let's see, how much time do we have left? Let me just ask here, are you guys okay if I'm going over, and if you need to leave? We have like 10 or 15 more minutes of stuff I want to just get through. So, and then if you have questions and things, feel free to put them in the chat, or if you want to stay after, talk a little bit more. All right, so this core design principle number 1 is the most important. And I'm not talking just for like a specific church. When we, you know, the prosocial trainings I've done, we've talked about coming back to talking about being curious about what do we care about as a group, as a family, what's important to us. We're just talking about it, or just engaging in it. It's kind of like back to that ACT matrix that we did, getting back to that, like what matters to us. And the more people are aligned with this first one, the other 8 tend to kind of fall into place a little bit. Like it still can be helpful to pay attention to it, but the more people are really coming back to this sense of having a shared purpose and a shared identity, the other things fall apart. Now, shared identity can be tricky, right? Because like you could, shared identity, someone could totally lose their identity I remember watching a documentary about North Korea a few years ago and seeing kind of almost what appeared to me to be almost a collective social mental illness in terms of the people and how, and yet at the same time, it was a very strong identity, just there seemed to be no sense of individual within it. So that seems to be one of the issues, is how do we, if humans are evolving mostly at the level of the group in terms of what transforms things, how do we reconcile that with our radical individualism that we've been living in? And how do we keep individuality while, and honor individual autonomy while engaging in these groups that we engage in? Okay, so this is a little irreverent of a slide here, but one of the, I'm basically pointing out, I think everyone kind of knows it, a big tension in a lot of religious and political organizations is this divide between, on kind of tradition of like a certain morals or values and kind of what's considered progress for a lot of us in terms of opening up to the variation of human experience in sexuality and gender and things like that, and seeing it as part of evolution, part of the beauty of variation on the earth. So one of the reason I have these three pictures up here, the one on the left is Elon Musk's dad, and then we have Boyd K. Packer, who was an apostle of the LDS Church who passed away a while ago. And this, of course, is this like kind of troll-like MAGA thing. So I'll just tell you really quickly. A couple of weeks ago, I saw a headline where Elon Musk's dad, it was saying he had just had, like his, I don't know how many kids, but he had another child. He has many, I guess. And he had a child with his stepdaughter, I guess, and she's 35 and he's, I don't know, 70 something. But his quote from the article was something like, that's the only reason we're here on Earth, is basically to populate the Earth, to pass our genes down. That's the only reason. And that reminded me of Boyd K. Packer. At one point during a general conference talk, he basically said, the plan of God is the plan of procreation. And I remember hearing that, and it was a talk where he said some things that later were kind of taken out of the talk about like, oh, God would never, create anyone to be gay. Why would God do that? And I remember hearing that and thinking, that can't be what the plan is. Like, of course, like, to be alive, humans need to procreate. For all of us to be here, two people had to come together and have a child. And yet there are so many people who will never do that on this earth. There are so many people who cannot do it for different reasons. And it just seems so different from the message you hear and read in the New Testament, Christ's message of paying attention to the orphans, the widows. It was kind of radically, in some way, turning evolution on its head, turn the other cheek. All these, forgive your enemies, all these things that seem very, in some ways, anti might makes right and survival of the fittest. And it was about something different. This third picture is because, I was doing some kind of shadow research on one of the Trump land message boards, which I don't recommend doing. But there was people having a discussion and someone referenced LGBT population and referenced them, trigger warning here, this is really upsetting, but referenced them as evolutionary dead ends. Just a really horrific kind of slur, right? And so if you have this view that the only reason a person is on Earth is to biologically procreate, then I guess that makes sense. However, it just totally goes against, everything in my own kind of sense of right and wrong and spirit to think that that's the only reason someone exists. And I love my kids and I'm glad I have children and I hope they have children, all sorts of, right? But the idea here with this multi-level selection and pro-social deliberate evolution is that genetic evolution is not the only source of inheritance, that cultural and behavioral evolution are happening, that we are multiplying and replenishing the earth with things every day, with the cultures we are creating. And so for me, the gospel isn't about just having literal offspring. Like, yes, that's important. People will continue to do that, but not everyone will, and that's okay too. But it's about multiplying and replenishing the earth with compassion, right? So this is kind of from my website I started, Center for Expanding Compassion. And these are some basic premises there. All beings and their contexts need compassion. Compassion is a behavior. Behavior is caused. Truth and reality is unfolding. Human capacity is unique. There is something about that we have to recognize, that human power is unique and can be uniquely damaging and horrific. With human power comes the ability and the responsibility to care and to expand compassion. So as I wrap up here, I'll just share some concerns people may have with this, and some of your questions might be related to this, maybe not. But this naturalistic fallacy, this idea of, a lot of people, when they start seeing the power of evolution, they start falling for this, and they start thinking things like, oh, if slavery existed, there must be some good reason, and so let's go ahead and justify slavery. Or one of the popular figures in society today, who people always tell me I should listen to him, but whenever I start listening to him, I get so annoyed I turn it off. Jordan Peterson, one of the things he says about sexual harassment in the workplace, he says, hey, this is how things evolve, so women shouldn't, wear makeup that makes them look like they are, being aroused if they don't want to be sexually harassed. So that's a version of the naturalistic fallacy, like saying because evolution might have directed something in a different way, it means it's good. So the naturalistic fallacy is something that we have to contend with. Like, social Darwinism is a very unfortunate term, because social Darwinism could be beautiful if it wasn't eugenics, if it wasn't trying to kill off people that we deemed as less than. But prosocial is a better term, right? Some people might have concerns that, like, well, is this just explaining away God? People that have more of a maybe literal or orthodox position. Some people might, like Carl Sagan there's a video on YouTube where someone asks him if he believes in God, and he says, well, it depends what you mean. If you're talking about the God of Spinoza or Einstein, kind of the forces of the universe, then I guess. But then he says, but why would we ever call that God? That just seems to like muddy the waters. We need to be clear. I think, though, that since he's been around, it's been proven that like religion is not going away, and even the understanding and study of evolution inspires a kind of, you could call it religious or a transcendent kind of something. And so anyway, danger of utopian projects, this is a big one, right? Like, any utopian project to build a better world has pretty scary shadows coming along with it. Okay, so here's some of the concerns people may have. I'll just kind of wrap up here. And this last point, so I don't really know how to describe my faith, and I would call it faith. To some people, I might describe myself as an atheist, and yet that doesn't really fit. To some people, an agnostic, that doesn't really fit. My favorite term, one of my favorite terms for God right now is life unfolding. I also like reality, truth, presence, everything, nothingness, void, love, all these names. One of the reasons Christianity is still very compelling to me is because, to me, it takes this unknowable, unnameable God, it brings it down into a human form, in the form of Christ. More important to me than Christ as a historical being or a measurable being out there on a planet or something is the kind of the command to like be like this, like wake up here and now as a child of creation, as a child, a creation of life unfolding that has a unique capacity to expand love, even for your enemies, even in the face of death. That is unique. That to me is worth sharing. When you think of God as life unfolding, it actually, for me, it actually is interesting because it works. I read the scriptures more than I used to. And I'm reading it all in this sense of looking at this God as a God that doesn't exist out there, but a God that is life unfolding and reality unfolding. Life unfolding swallows up death and new life comes out of it. Life unfolding is a father or mother or parent of all organisms. No language can contain it. We are always and have always been a part of it. Like Carl Sagan says, that we are made of star stuff. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. My last quote here I want to share is Albert Einstein. This is one of my very favorites. He says, "A human being is part of a whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself or herself or themselves and thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circles of compassion, to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." That is one of the most beautiful prophetic statements, I think, of discipleship I've ever read. You know, can we widen our circles of compassion to embrace all living creatures? And to me, that's the task. That's what I want to be engaged with. That's what wakes me up early in the morning with thoughts that I can't stop, and with a sense, at times a little bit too much grandiosity. I have to measure it and think of, I use my own spheres of influence and come back to reality and say, okay, what's my circle of compassion right now? It's my son. It's my wife. It's this person I'm with right here, right now. But it's also, these truths that we have access to, or whatever we're kind of called to. All right, so that's the basic presentation of a prosocial gospel. So thank you guys for, going a little over with me. If you have any thoughts or questions or anything, feel free to bring them up.